There's a lot of conclusions that are drawn in the medical literature that are simply unwarranted. So if, for example, we have a look at the Sydney Diet Heart Study or the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, which are both from the late 60s, early 70s, they actually found that removing saturated fat from the diet and replacing it with polyunsaturated seed oils was actually deleterious to health. And yet, for reasons only known to the investigators, and I think we can actually paraphrase a little bit here, because one of the investigators of one of these studies was actually asked before he died in an interview how they published the results. And the simple fact is they delayed publication significantly. And even when they originally published, I think the Minnesota Coronary Experiment was published 16 years later after the conclusion of the study, they didn't provide data on all-cause mortality. And the study investigator simply said, we didn't like the results we got, so we didn't publish. The Sydney Diet Heart Study, they never published the all-cause mortality data either. And the only reason we actually know the results of these studies today is because somebody went and dug out the results from old basements. They actually discovered them, decoded them, reinterpreted all the results according to good scientific methodology. And lo and behold, we have the results. Large-scale randomized control trials show that eliminating saturated fat from the diet in place of polyunsaturated fats, that is, reducing your saturated fats, actually increased mortality. And we would never know this. This was good quality science that was destined to be lost to history. The Women's Health Initiative is another example, a little bit more surprising because it's in the modern era. They actually had a largest randomized controlled trial in the world, $700 million US, and they had a group of females who went on a low saturated fat diet. And the only statistically significant finding from the whole study was a 26% increased risk of complications such as angina and heart attacks and so on and so forth. And given that that was the only finding of the whole study, you would think it would be front and center of the results, front and center of the conclusion, mentioned in every press conference. Well, strike out on all three accounts. It wasn't in the results table. It wasn't in the conclusion. It was never mentioned in any of the press conferences. It was written in obscure language on page 661 of the reporting journal. This is just absolutely amazing. You know, we have solid science and it's literally buried. And we have plenty of other examples of this going on. We have misinterpretation of bad science. So in 2020, I came across a paper that studied cholesterol supplementation and atorvastatin, which is a statin, a cholesterol-lowering medication use, in New Zealand white rabbits. Clearly, has no applicability at all for humans. And yet, in the conclusion, the authors of this paper suggested their results did apply to human patients. This is 2020, and we're using rabbit data to inform our use of statins. There was another study that actually looked at statin use, and it found that it actually increased the incidence of diabetes. So if I actually can quote, they said that it was a New England journal, actually this is a few years old, 2008, it was a statin trial. They found that there was a significant increase in physician-reported incidence of diabetes, and there was a statistically significant increase in HbA1c, which is a marker of average blood glucose levels. The authors also acknowledged that prior to this time, there were independent studies that confirmed worsening sugar control for at least 3 different types of statin medication. So on the basis of this, they had statistically significant findings. Now, my understanding, and everybody's understanding of statistical significance, is that it represents findings that are unlikely to be due to chance. We want to take out the element of chance, and we do that to a reasonable degree. Still, in the conclusion, these authors said, well, this worsening sugar control could reflect the play of chance. That defies the logic of having statistically significant findings. They simply could not compel themselves to look at the science and understand the science and say, oh, maybe statins are bad for diabetes. Maybe this is the evidence. Nope, they just said, oh, look, it's probably a random chance. Never mind that it reached statistical significance. There's a problem where we have something called eminence-based medicine, and that's totally contrary to evidence-based medicine. Evidence-based medicine means we look at the data, we draw a conclusion. Eminence-based medicine means that we put our trust in other people, not the data. We actually allow eminent people, experts, if you will, to provide us with their conclusion because they're clearly smarter than we, and we can accept at face value everything they say. So there was a paper from the American Diabetes Association, which is very, very heavily cited, and it's on the use of statins in diabetes. And I had a lot of people tweeting this paper at me and emailing me this paper and saying, see, this proves that statins are good in diabetes. I went and looked at the references. There were 6 references on this paper. 3 of the references did not include all-cause mortality as a measure of outcome. That is, they didn't actually ask the question, let alone answer the question, whether taking statins for diabetes, patients with diabetes made them live longer. The 3 studies that they included that did actually ask the question about all-cause mortality, they all had insignificant findings. Not one of the references in this paper showed what they said it did. And yet, this is a very heavily cited position statement from an expert body that recommends the use of statins in diabetes. And this is just madness. And if people actually understood that the wool was literally being pulled over their eyes, you can't trust the conclusion, you can't trust these guidelines, you can't trust these expert bodies. You have to look at the raw data. When you look at the raw data, the truth is very, very different. I don't think there's any ulterior motives on the side of doctors who are, making these conclusions. I think it just comes down to pride and intellectual arrogance. They're used to being the smartest people in the room, and they really don't want to concede that they could be wrong about anything. And I mean, I can speak to this from personal experience because I haven't always been an advocate of low seed oil, low carbohydrate, ketogenic style diets. I used to be, lock, stock and barrel straight down the line, making these recommendations that people eat low fats on and so forth. And I was absolutely adamant in that. And the position I was coming from was supreme confidence that I'd had an academic education and therefore I was right. I just hadn't even considered the possibility that I was wrong because I trusted the people who had taught me. I get excited when I read a research paper where they actually find against their original hypothesis and they report it clearly as such. There was a paper from the American Journal of Cardiology in 2004, and they predicted that saturated fat would increase LDL oxidation. So just to make very clear, LDL, low-density lipoprotein, which is often pejoratively and incorrectly referred to as bad cholesterol. So LDL in and of itself is not harmful, but if that LDL becomes damaged, and one of the ways it becomes damaged is through oxidation, then it can contribute to what we call the atherosclerotic burden or plaque, basically lining your blood vessels. So this paper predicted that if people had more saturated fat, they would have higher oxidation levels of LDL. And in actual fact, they found that it was polyunsaturated fats or vegetable and seed oils that did this. And in their conclusion, they stated, these experiments provide convincing evidence that our original hypothesis was not correct. Clear, unambiguous language. And I think that is just fantastic science. That is how science should happen. There was a Cochrane systematic review published on vegan diets and cardiovascular risk parameters. Interestingly enough, they looked at all the randomized controlled trials that had been done on vegan diets. And not one of those trials, not one randomized controlled trial available for this systematic review actually looked at clinical outcomes. What that means is it didn't actually look at things that actually matter to patients. It didn't look to see whether they had shortness of breath or they had impaired cognition or how they're, whether they had more heart attacks or these kind of things. So the only thing we can rely on for this research is surrogate markers. Surrogate marker means we see something like a blood test moving in a certain direction and we would assume that that's bad because our experience is that, high triglycerides, for instance, is not a good sign. That a lowering of your HDL, good cholesterol, is not a good sign. And this systematic review actually found that HDL cholesterol went down on vegan diets and that triglycerides increased. And they actually acknowledged that these changes in the lipids were opposite to what they had predicted. Now, funnily enough, I suspect they meant to write opposite to what they'd actually hoped for. But either way, they actually did acknowledge that the changes of these direction and certainly suggesting that they're actually not good for health. So I think the state of affairs is, as of the 25th of February 2021, the best evidence we have for vegan diets on health appears to be deleterious. The LDL change, the LDL actually also went down on a vegan diet. And it depends on your worldview of LDL. If you subscribe to the old debunked theory that LDL is a bad thing, then you can say, well, maybe these changes in HDL and triglycerides are offset by the change in LDL. But the simple fact is a lowering of LDL is almost certainly associated with an increase in cardiovascular risk. So, and we've got meta-analysis and systematic level of data proving that. If I give you an example of one study, so it was done by Bathum, Bathum, in 2013, and they had a touch over 118,000 subjects who were all over age 50. And what they actually found that the people with the highest level of LDL had on average about a 50% reduced chance of dying than the group of people with the lowest LDL. So you can flip that the other way and say that if you have the lowest level of LDL, your risk of dying is doubled. Well, these people were aged over 50. So there's still a lot of life left in at age 50. They also excluded people with diagnosed heart problems and cholesterol problems who had been prescribed statin medication. That excluded people with cardiovascular disease. They excluded people with diabetes. They excluded people with any hint of terminal disease at all. So for all intents and purposes, this was a healthy, younger population. And they found that the lowest LDL level increased your all-cause mortality by about double compared to having the highest all-cause mortality. LDL serves an important function in our body. If we had no LDL, we would simply die. Full stop. However, LDL can be damaged. And if the LDL becomes damaged, then we have a problem. And because what actually happens is that normally our LDL has a lifespan. Our liver excretes something called a lipoprotein. It's called a very low density lipoprotein. As that very low density lipoprotein, it's like a big boat and it's got triglycerides and cholesterol inside. So cholesterol is just a molecule. Cholesterol doesn't actually mean LDL. LDL is so much more complex than cholesterol. It's what we call a lipoprotein. It's a complex structure, but it carries some cholesterol inside. So this term to call LDL cholesterol is just frankly wrong. Otherwise, if a passenger was riding on a bus, you don't call the bus the passenger. The bus is the bus. The passenger is just what's inside. So this VLDL molecule gets released from the liver and it gives cholesterol to tissues around the body that need it. It gives triglycerides to where it needs to be for energy or for storage. And as it does so, it shrinks. And as it shrinks a little bit, it gets an arbitrary name change to intermediate density lipoprotein. And then as it donates a bit more of a cargo, it shrinks again. It's like a deflating balloon. Same particle, it just now has a different name, arbitrarily different name. And after it goes from intermediate density lipoprotein, it becomes a low density lipoprotein. And then this low density lipoprotein can be taken back up by the liver and the cycle continues. And this is important for life. And it's also got immune functioning roles and a bunch of other stuff. Now, if the LDL is damaged, the pathway by which the liver takes it back up out of circulation stops working. Basically, you've got one molecule on the outside of the LDL molecule or the particle that identifies it. It's called an ApoB100. That's its security swipe card. And if you damage that security swipe card, then you can't get taken out of the blood by the liver, and then you start to accumulate. And one of the things that can damage this ApoB100 security swipe card is oxidative stress. So we actually know that it's oxidative stress that turns LDL bad. And if LDL is damaged, then it can accumulate inside the internal wall of the blood vessels. It actually looks like if you've got a long blood vessel going down, you've got little small blood vessels coming in from the outside. They're called vasa vasorum. It's basically a tiny blood supply to the big blood vessel. And these LDL particles actually travel through these small blood vessels, and they can lodge into the middle of the wall, what we call the intima. And that's where these fatty deposits form. But if your LDL is not oxidized, that process doesn't occur. And the interesting thing is that a high triglyceride level and a low HDL level are really just markers of oxidative stress. That's a simple way to think about them. So if we just think about, damaged LDL is what causes the deposition. And if you have a high triglyceride level and a low HDL level, then you're much more likely to have damaged LDL particles. And it really is that simple. And this is well supported by evidence too. So everybody's worried that once you've got these fat deposits in the blood vessel wall, well, they must be there forever. Well, that's not true. We know that what we call plaque regression is possible. And in observational studies on plaque regression, they actually found that some people were able to get their plaques would actually disappear, or they would actually shrink over time. And some people, their plaques would actually get worse. They would actually increase or progress. And what they found was that those people who had plaque progression, on average, had LDL levels about 50% of those people who had plaque regression. Think about that for a second. We've actually got documented evidence in observational studies that it's possible to reverse these atherosclerotic plaques. And the people with the highest LDL levels are the ones who get reversal. The people with lower LDL levels actually have progression. And I don't know about you, but just that single observation should be enough to debunk this whole LDL myth that all LDL is bad. Yes, LDL can be bad, but only if it's oxidized. If you're otherwise metabolically healthy and it's not oxidized and it's not damaged, then you're going to be okay for the most part.